Good morning. Good morning. Can people hear me? Get this close enough to my mouth so you can hear me. Welcome to the UW Retirement Association's Committee for Financial Matters and Retirement annual presentation from ETF and SWIB. Well, our first speaker is going to be Mr. Rick Smurl. Mr. Smurl joined the State of Wisconsin Investment Board just this last January as its executive director. He has more than 25 years of investing, management, and leadership experience. Previously, he served as a partner and chief operating officer at William Blair Investment Management, overseeing all infrastructure activities across the firm's institutional asset management, mutual funds, and private wealth management businesses. Prior to joining William Blair, Mr. Smurl was chief legal counsel of the former Milwaukee-based Strong Capital Management. So he does have a prior Wisconsin residence here. He was also a partner at the law firm of Los Angeles-based Kessel, Young & Logan. Mr. Smurl holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of California at Irvine and a Juris Doctorate from Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. He also completed an executive education program at the University of Virginia's Darden Graduate School of Business Administration. And we sincerely welcome Mr. Smurl back to the state of Wisconsin and hope him all the best, because his very best does the best for us. Our second speaker will be Mr. Robert J. Conlon, who we have heard before and are very familiar with and very appreciative of. As Secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Employee Trust Funds, ETF, since January 2012, Mr. Conlon is responsible for overseeing the provision of employee benefit plans covering 620,000 participants and over $100 billion in assets. Mr. Conlon has over 25 years of public service experience in Wisconsin, including 11 years at ETF. Prior to his 2007 appointment to Deputy Secretary, he was the agency's Director of Legislation, Communications, and Planning. Before joining ETF, Mr. Conlon served as a senior staff attorney at the nonpartisan Wisconsin Legislative Council. A native of Durand, Wisconsin, he holds a law degree from the University of Wisconsin and a bachelor's degree from St. John's University of Minnesota. Let's see. This program will be set up so that we have both speakers making their presentations. We will then take a break, and then everyone is invited back to ask questions, and the speakers will take that time. That may mean that our initial break may be a little more than 50 or 60 minutes, but please bear with us, and hope you enjoy the program. It should be a good year to report on.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks for that nice introduction. I'll probably walk around a little bit, but I want to make clear a couple other things that Jack mentioned. I was born in Wisconsin, and I'm a Packers fan. I see some Packers sweatshirts and Packers gear, so in case anybody was concerned about me being a Bears fan, I'm not. So I was born in Waukesha. At a fairly young age, though, I moved out to California. My father was working for the Waukesha County Health Department, and then he ended up going to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, liked California, and ended up getting a job with the University of California. So like many of you here, my father worked for the University of California for 30 years and is a retiree of the University of California system. My wife is a elementary school teacher. She worked in New Berlin, and so she's a participant in the plan. My father-in-law spent 40 years working for the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, so he's a retiree in the plan as well. And my mother-in-law spent 22 years working for the for the Wisconsin Technical College, including in Waukesha and then later up in the Green Bay area. So I have a lot of ties to the state of Wisconsin, and a lot of ties to the retirement system as well. So I wanted to make sure you knew that background about me. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be able to work at SWIB on behalf of the state of Wisconsin and all of you as retirees in the pension plan system. So I'm excited to be here. I'm less than 90 days in, though. So Bob's the expert. So to the extent in the question and answer session you ask me any hard questions, I'll let Bob answer them. So we'll get started. And here's the agenda. It's similar to the ones we've had in prior years. The performance is different, though. But for those of you who've been here in the past, the format's the same. We're going to talk about performance, investment strategy, costs, which are a big part of our performance. We're going to talk about looking forward, and then a little bit of update on SWIB. And as Jack mentioned at the end, after Bob's done, we'll take a break, and then I'll answer some questions for you. So let's go to the first section on performance. So obviously, it was a great year from an absolute standpoint in the core trust fund. It returned 16.2% versus its benchmark of 15.7%. So what does that mean? It means we SWIB beat our benchmark, which is important. Our benchmark gets set by outside consultants, and those consultants help us with asset allocation decisions and ultimately help us determine whether we're doing a good job or not relative to other similar peers, including other pension plans. So you can see we did well on an absolute basis, 16.2%, and we were 0.5% better than our benchmark. So a very good year. Obviously, I had nothing to do with that, though. But it's a good time to come in. I'm glad it's a positive 16.2 instead of a negative 16.2. The 5-year numbers you can see are also quite good. On the left side there, the 8.6% returns. That's on an annualized basis over the last 5 years. Again, beating the benchmark by 0.4%. The 10-year is a little lower. Obviously, the 10-year, when you look back in time, that would include the 2008 time period, which was the financial crisis. And while I wasn't at SWIB, I was in the industry, and I know how painful it was back in 2008, and I'm sure many of you remember that time all too well. So that 10-year number does take into account that very difficult, challenging year. It'll roll off on the 10-year number going forward. 20-year number, similarly, 7.1% return, and again, beating the benchmark by about 0.4%. For those of you that are invested in the variable fund, obviously a tremendous return. 23.2%. You can see, interestingly enough, when I looked at this, I won't spend a lot of time here, but I'd ask you to look at the 20-year number, which is 7.1%. I'm going to go back to that prior slide. It's also 7.1%. That's just an anomaly. If you're in the variable fund, there's going to be a lot more volatility up and down, but it's just, I think, a coincidence that the 20-year number on the variable fund happens to be the exact same returns as there are in the core fund. I don't think we'll see that too often. Okay, so Bob's team really focuses more on the annuity adjustments. SWIB manages the money. Bob's team administers the benefits and works with some of the outside consultants that set the annuity adjustments. So I'm assuming Bob's going to talk a little bit more about that. But you can see on the core fund, the annuity adjustment, which takes effect beginning May 1st, was 2.4%. And on the variable fund, it was 17%. Here's those numbers. You can see, as I mentioned earlier, that 2008 return, which was very challenging. very, very difficult period. You can see down at the bottom of the slide that one-year performance was down around 25, 26%, which is really, really tough. Hopefully we won't see a year like that during my tenure. I would not want to be up on the stage talking about that, but sometimes it just comes with the territory. So investment strategy, and I think this is really important, and it's important to me when I joined SWIB and I was thinking about the opportunity to understand the funding level. You know, obviously having lived down in Illinois, where funding levels of pension plans are nowhere near the levels that they are in Wisconsin. As you all probably know, the Wisconsin retirement system is nearly 100% fully funded, which is fantastic. And whereas down in Illinois, it's significantly less than that. There's lots of troubles with the pension plan system. The ability to meet those payments over time, I think, is severely challenging for those down there. And I think if somebody asked me if I wanted to take one of those jobs in Illinois, I probably would have said politely, no, thank you. But I think one of the great things about the Wisconsin plan, it's a shared risk model, and so when we talked earlier about the annuity adjustment, I certainly appreciate what that means for each of you. But it also means that we have the ability, because we're fully funded, to be a little more conservative in terms of how we think about investing. We don't have to reach for returns, take outsized risks, because the plan is not fully funded, or we're trying to hit some targets that maybe aren't all that realistic. So I think that's important. We're going to come back to that in a moment, that whole concept and theory. But from a strategy standpoint, we're going to try to be a little more conservative. We're going to try to keep it in the middle of the fairway for those of you that golf. That means we're not going to take outside risk. We're also not going to run it overly conservative either. This is a really, really interesting slide. I raised this with the team a couple weeks ago, and later, if we have time for questions and answers, I'd be happy to answer more questions on it. But I'm going to walk you through it right now. If you look at in 1995, you can see that. Let me take a step back. What this chart is showing us, and it was from the Wall Street Journal. The source was Callan Associates. Callan is a very well-known investment consultant that provides consulting services to the pension plan industry, including to SWIB. The Wall Street Journal ran this chart, and what it shows here is that back in 1995, in order to generate 7.5% returns, and you can see the returns expected are consistent. Whether it's 1995, 2005, or 2015, the returns are always 7.5%. So what Callan is doing here is they're telling pension plans that in order to generate 7.5% returns, here's what you would do from an asset allocation standpoint. So back in 1995, it was relatively easy, and relative being the operative word, to generate 7.5% returns. When I was driving in the car, well, I wasn't driving, Chris was driving, so don't get worried, but I was on my phone looking up 10-year Treasury bond yields back in 1995, 2005, and 2015. And back in 1995, a 10-year Treasury bond was yielding about 8%. And what does that mean? It means that, like they show here, that in 1995, I started in the industry in 1992, so I remember this. Back in 1995, you, a pension plan like SWIB, could have had a 100% portfolio in 10-year Treasury bonds, which are considered some of the safest assets in the world. They're highly liquid, and still generate 7.5% returns. It was returning 7.8 something percent, the yield on the 10-year. So fast forward just 10 years later to 2014, the yield on the 10-year Treasury was cut in half, so no longer about 8%, it was down around 4%. And so Callan was advising its pension plan clients that no longer could you have a 100% bond portfolio. You needed to have a different asset allocation. And you can see here what they're doing. They'd since cut what was a 100% bond recommendation to about 50%. They had added equities. You can see the 20%, that's the green there. Small cap, now we're introducing more risk because you're investing in small cap, but you needed to generate higher returns. And then non-US equities, so now Callan was advising its clients to invest in global stocks, international emerging market stocks. Real estate gets introduced into the portfolio, so you can see a recommendation of an allocation for 5% in real estate and 4% in private equity. Massive difference in just 10 years in terms of the complexity of managing a pension plan portfolio. It's just in that very, very short, it's a blink of an eye in terms of an investment history. And you can see the massive change and the amount of complexity. And then also the standard deviation, it's another measure of risk. So in other words, it's telling you you're increasing your risk. Not only are you changing your asset allocation, you're making it more complex, but the risk is going up. The risk of your ability to achieve the returns. Again, fast forward 10 more years later, again, a blink of an eye, Treasury yields, when I was looking at, these were all as of January 1st, cut in half yet again. So 10-year Treasury on January 1st was yielding under 2%. It's now back to 2.8 something as of today. It's risen a little bit, but still well below the 7.5%. But what's amazing to me is that standard deviation number. It's tripled. So in other words, the risk that one needs to take to achieve the 7.5% returns has tripled over time. And the asset allocation is far different, far more complex. So when we talk about, and I'm going to get to this later, the need to improve our systems and our technology, the personnel, the portfolio managers that are managing the money, and the operations and the IT staff to support that, you can see here on this chart why that's the case. And I will tell you, as somebody who's been in the industry for 25 years, if the Wall Street Journal runs this chart again in 2025, it's going to look far more complex in 2025 than it did just in 2015. So it's getting increasingly difficult to generate these returns. And it's really important. Happy to come back to this during the Q&A session if anyone has questions. So I mentioned some of these things earlier. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. The Wisconsin retirement system is one of the best funded pension plans in the world. Not just the country, the slide says the country, but in the world. And we all should be very, very proud of that. It's a fantastic system. It's a great model. Oftentimes people talk about pension plan systems in other places in the world. So sometimes people will point to Australia or Canada or one of the Northern European countries as having a great model for pension plans, but we have a fantastic one right here in Wisconsin. I mentioned our strategy. It's really focused on long-term results. While we're pleased about that 17% number that I highlighted earlier, we really focus on the long term. It was really more about that 20-year number that I showed as well, which was around 7%. We want to generate reasonable returns, and we want to mitigate potential risks. And we do that through diversification. So going back to this slide here, no longer could you put 100% of your portfolio in bonds, but similarly, we wouldn't put 100% of the portfolio in real estate or another asset class. We need to be diversified. And here's the actual diversification. You can see how we're invested. This is as of 12/31/17, and it looks fairly similar to the recommendation that Callan, the outside consultant, had delivered and had been presented in the Wall Street Journal. Again, a fairly high degree of complexity. People talk about us finding the Goldilocks zone. You've probably, if you've been to these presentations in the past, I listened to some of the old presentations, and you want the porridge to be just right. And similar, I usually use the golf analogy. I did that earlier. Keep it in the middle of the fairway. And that's how I play golf. I just keep pushing the ball down the middle of the fairway. I'm not very good, but if I can keep it going forward and keep it going straight, I can hold my own usually. And that's kind of how I think about investing. But we work closely with Bob and his team and their actuarial firms to help us identify the appropriate return targets and also identify the proper asset allocation, the percentages that we're going to invest in each of the different asset classes that I showed earlier. I mentioned it's going to, the third bullet there, it's going to get increasingly difficult over time. We're expecting that. We're building for that long term, and that's why we're putting in systems and technology and continuing to hire people from the asset management industry with significant experience to generate the returns that are necessary to achieve the results. Costs. Costs are important too. It's got to be both costs and value. So on the cost side, what we've done in Wisconsin is also really unique. A lot of pension plans, and you've probably read about it in the paper, continue to pay what I think some would argue are excessive fees to outside investment managers. I can say that because I came from one, so I know what those investment managers charge a lot more than the costs of us doing the investment management in-house. So we've pulled a lot of that in-house in order to save costs. And even on a comparison against other peers, other pension plans and other organizations, you can see here we're still doing it really cost effectively, and that's really important. We're going to continue to keep an eye on the cost structure to make sure that if we decide to move assets in-house, that we can do it more cost effectively, but also generate good performance. You can see the cost savings on that second bullet point. We're able to achieve cost savings here. It's saying 110, so around $100 million a year that we're saving and ultimately drops to the bottom line to benefit the participants versus the costs of other pension plan structures who may outsource more of the investment management services to third-party managers. And as I said, that helps performance. So going back to those numbers, at the end of the day, the performance that Bob and his team calculate include the costs of management. So those are detracted from the actual returns that are reported. And so if we can keep the costs low and we can generate good performance, ultimately that helps keep the pension plan system nearly 100% fully funded. Hopefully will help continue to increase the dividend over time and generate the returns that are necessary to keep stability in the plan. You can see here we're managing, the blue is SWIB, the gold color is outside, external managers. So about 2/3 of the assets, 63%, are managed internally by SWIB. And yet, 2/3 are managed internally, but only 21% of the costs. So that's really highlighting the cost-saving advantage that we have because 37% of the external costs, of the external managers are costing 79% of the total cost. So we're going to continue to try to move assets in-house where it makes sense. And over time, over the last 5 years, we've generated $759 million in value add on behalf of the participants. Going forward, I mentioned many of these things, and I can see I'm kind of out of time and maybe even cutting into Bob's time. But importantly, we're optimistic in our ability to continue to deliver high-quality results, good performance on behalf of the plan. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got a great system. We just need to keep it running and generating positive returns. With that, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Good morning. So just a little quiz to start out with. How many of you are first-timers here at this? There's a few. Good. Welcome. Always nice to see new people. And the rest of you had nothing better to do? Is that what? So before I begin, I just got a typo right on the first page. Clearly, if you look outside, it's not April 17th. I don't know. I was promised an April presentation. This is crazy. So I want to talk about a few things today. Talk about system health. Rick already touched on some of this. Talk about the annuity adjustments. Talk a little bit about what's going on downtown that might affect the WRS. And then some updates on what's going on with ETF and things like that. And then we'll, again, take a little break and come back and answer some questions. I am going to walk around a little bit, and I apologize for that. I started this job when we were in the midst of reducing retirees' annuities. And so this may look like pacing, but it's really a moving target. I got used to that, and I can't shake the habit. So let's talk about the WRS. Some of you have seen slides like this before. Very well-funded system, nearly 100% funded. This market value, this is the new in vogue GASB, Government Accounting Standards Board target that we have to report. This number is from December 31, 2016. We'll have the 2017 numbers available soon, but we were at 99.1%. That's a lot more volatile because it's based on market value at the time. I would expect our 2017 number, after the very good performance that SWIB had, to be significantly higher than the 99%. We pay about $5.2 billion a year in pension benefits in Wisconsin. That's money that's going right back into our communities. 86% of our retirees stay right here in Wisconsin. And so they're getting that $5.2 billion and they're spending it in our towns, our cities, our villages, all over the state. So that money that the pension system pays out goes right back in, helps create the jobs, the economy throughout Wisconsin. Not only does it help the entire economy of Wisconsin, but we do it at a fairly low cost. This is an interesting comparison that the National Association of State Retirement Administrators does based on census data. Generally around the country, governments spend about 4.7% of their revenue funding their pension plans for public employees. In Wisconsin, that number is significantly lower, about 2.2%, okay? So not only is that money going back into our communities, but we're having to pay less of it to fund the system because we are so well funded. I think that's an important takeaway that I think a lot of legislators don't quite understand about our pension system in Wisconsin, and we're working to get that word out. Who's in the WRS? We got about 197,000 retirees. This is just a small sample, but about 197,000 folks have retired. We got about 167,000 or so who are owed a benefit at some point, but they no longer work. These are the inactive people who haven't taken their retirement benefit, and about 250-some thousand people who are active employees, still working and hoping to take their benefit in the future. We cover about 1,500 Wisconsin employers, cities, villages, towns, school districts, all across the state of Wisconsin. Most every major community is enrolled in the WRS, except for two major ones. What are the two major ones? Milwaukee, city and county of Milwaukee, they have their own pension systems. We'll talk about one of them a little bit later. Now, we all know that retirees in Wisconsin generally earn lavish benefits, and they don't need to worry about money. They got it good. Well, interestingly, that's not actually true. This is kind of the average makeup of people in the general category. So this is most teachers, most blue-collar, and most white-collar workers in Wisconsin. Average retirement age, 61.2. People are not retiring at the age of 50, like some seem to think. 22 years of service on average. And a median annual benefit of about $18,000 a year. That's a good basic benefit, but maybe not exactly what the stereotype suggests. So over on the right-hand side, when you think about Wisconsin, the fact that we have about 600,000 members in the system, we have about 5 million participant in the system or some sort of beneficiary, a child, a spouse, something like that. The WRS, again, $5.2 billion, significant impact on the Wisconsin economy, affecting people across the state. And that's something that we are routinely reminding legislators of. Regardless of where you come from in the state as a legislator, you have people in your district that are WRS participants, WRS retirees, and WRS employers who participate. So a few other interesting statistics that I always like to remind people of. Average retirement age. Again, it's back when things were good. Back in the 90s, the retirement age was a little bit lower. People were retiring earlier. The stock market was doing well. Healthcare wasn't quite as expensive. But over time, we have seen that retirement age of WRS participants gradually creep up. And my memory isn't what it used to be. Something happened in 2011 that caused a lot of people to retire early. That's that little spike there. We'll look into that again. But generally, the trend has been up for people staying around and working longer in the system. And not only are people working longer, but they are living longer in general as well. Now, this is an interesting chart. It shows the average age at death of WRS participants. And you can see that over time, you go back 20 years, women were living just over 83 years, and men were dying at about 78, 79 years old. And those lines have done a pretty good job of going up. Now, women seem to have given up here and aren't living quite as long. Maybe that's because men are living longer. Not sure there's a connection. While it's all good news that everybody's living longer, the bad news is we got to pay for that. And that has an effect on the pension system, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit down the road. So those annuity adjustments that Rick talked about. Let's remind everybody, Rick talked about this, core and variable returns. This is gross of fees, so before we take the expenses out. And that translated, is this news to anybody? Did everybody see our announcement on this, 2.4%? Okay, core fund, 2.4%. You should see that in your May 1st checks. Variable fund, 17%. Again, how many people here are in the variable fund? Okay, so that explains the smiles, okay. And you can see, I always like this chart because it kind of, you know which fund you're looking at when you look at the variable fund chart because it is variable. We always like to show this, just kind of the value of a pension over time and how the various core and variable fund pensions have performed over periods. And you can look at this on your own time, but basically what we do is we assume retirees start with a $1,000 annuity. And maybe they're in the core fund, maybe they're in the variable fund. And based on when they retired, we show over time what that $1,000 has turned into. So for example, if you retired in 1993 and you were in the variable fund, that $1,000 has doubled at this point, more than doubled. The core fund hasn't done too bad either. You're up to $1,800 in that. If you retired in 1998, the numbers aren't quite as good, but there's still a good positive trend. This is kind of the lost decade in here where we had two major market meltdowns, the tech bubble in the early 2000s and the great financial crisis in 2008. That put a real damper on the growth of annuities in both the core and the variable fund. And these folks, especially the people in 2008, they are just starting to get kind of above water at this point. So one of the things, just as soon as we're having a good time, I always like to bring people back to reality and start talking about what might happen in the future. And these are our projections of core fund annuity adjustments. We don't bother trying to project what the variable fund is going to be because it's so variable and the returns and the annuity adjustments are very close to the returns. But on the core side, there are a couple things that we assume. Our overall target for investments is a 7.2% return. That's what we think we ought to be able to earn over the long term. Gains over 7.2% are positive for the system, and those get paid out as annuity adjustments. If we don't hit the 7.2%, those are losses for the system, and sometimes we have to take back previously granted annuity adjustments. So what we try to do is we try to project. If in 2018 we hit the 7.2% return target, what would that do for annuity adjustments? And that, the upper limit on this is kind of what would happen if we hit 7.2% every year going forward. And what you see is we would produce an annuity adjustment of right around 2%, 2.2, 3, kind of getting back into very solid positive returns if we earn what we expect to earn over the next several years. But we also try to, we also try to bring some reality to it and show what would happen or what it would take in terms of investment performance to generate a negative annuity adjustment next year. And that's what this bottom dotted line is. And what you can see is that SWIB, if SWIB in the core fund has a performance of negative 5% for 2018, we could start tipping back down into the negative adjustments. So we've got some room to play with there. The investment performance for 2017 really helped us and is going to carry forward for a long time, and that's good. So we've got a little bit of room to miss on investment performance, but I thought I heard Rick promise another performance like 2017 this year. Maybe I didn't, but you can ask him about that during the question and answer period. A couple other key tidbits for the WRS. We hear a lot about how public pensions are simply taxpayer-funded benefits that get paid out to people. The reality is a little bit different. What this chart shows you is that about 75% or so of the benefits that we pay out are generated from investment return over time. Now, that 75% varies from year to year, whether it's 75, 70, 80, it kind of bounces up and down. The point here is that the vast majority of what gets paid out in retirement benefits comes from investment returns. That's why when Rick talks about the future challenges, of generating return, it's important to keep this in mind. The harder it is to generate the investment return, the higher the employer share and the employee share of the costs go. You got to get the money from somewhere. If it's not coming from investment return, it needs to come from some other source, and those other sources are active employees and active employers. It also, as you know, affects annuity adjustments going forward. So it's very important to keep our eye on that investment performance. Rick had very similar slides to this. I used a different color because I like green. But again, very similar performance over time. When we talk about investment performance, one of the things that you often see in the popular press is that public pension systems use unreasonable assumptions about what they're going to earn over time. And therefore, their funding status is inflated, they're playing with phony money, they're not telling you the full truth, all that sort of thing. What they're generally referring to there is the investment return assumptions. If you assume that you're going to earn a lot more than you're actually going to earn, your costs today are going to be lower because you're assuming you're going to earn more. Your costs are lower, but if you don't earn that amount, your future costs are going to be much higher. So it's important to make sure that what you are assuming that your investments are going to grow by reflect reality. And a lot of politicians love to jump in on this and say, oh, there's no way you're going to earn this or you're going to earn that, or here's the right amount. In Wisconsin, we actually have a process for dealing with that issue. We work with the actuaries every 3 years on a study. And it's a study of experience in the system. So all the things that happen, investments, how many people are dying, how many people are living longer, that sort of thing. So that study, by the way, is called the 3-year experience study. It's a very catchy title that the actuaries gave it. But every 3 years, we look at that experience in the system and we look at every single assumption that goes into the WRS and the calculations of benefits and the calculations of contributions. And when the actuaries do that, one of the key drivers, because investments are so important to the system's health, is they focus on the rate of return assumption, the amount we assume we're going to earn in the investment space. This is not a number that the actuaries just pull out of the air and plug into a formula. They have a stable of outside investment consultants that they tap. They work with Rick's investment consultants at SWIB. They exercise their own best judgment in their experience in doing this. And they make a realistic assessment of what is a reasonable rate of return. That recommendation goes to the ETF board, which generally accepts the actuary's recommendation, and then that gets folded into our assumptions for future years. This has been going on around the country now for the last several years. You recall Rick talking about that chart from the Wall Street Journal and Callan showing how difficult and complex it is to get return out of the markets. What we have been seeing across the country is retirement systems lowering that assumed rate of return, the amount they think they're going to be able to earn in the investment markets. Back in 2001, that median investment return assumption amongst plans was 8%. Okay? Today, it's 7.5%. And it continues to go down. Every month, we see another plan that lowers their investment return assumption. Back in 2001, there were plans that were assuming They were going to earn more than 8.5% over time. Coming off the 90s, great investment performance. Hey, this is going to last forever. Today, there's, I think, one plan that has an assumption at 8.5%, and that's fixed in statute, and they're having trouble getting the law changed to lower the assumption. There are plans today that have assumed rates of return below 7%, assuming that they're not going to earn quite 7% in the investment markets. As I mentioned earlier, our assumed rate of return is 7.2%. This year, later in 2018, is the year that our actuaries will be coming into the ETF board with their recommendations on the new assumed rate of return. I don't know if they're going to change that, but the trend seems to be, and I think most experts agree, that the investment markets will be a tough place to earn the kind of returns we've seen in the past going forward. If they recommend reduction in that rate of return, it will have some upward pressure on contribution rates. If it's an accurate reflection of what we actually end up earning, that will have an effect on annuity adjustments going forward. But again, this is kind of part and parcel of the story that the investment environment is different now than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, and we'll continue to see that played out. While there's a lot of strengths in our shared risk and reward system that we have in the WRS, this is one area that we're all in this together. It's going to affect everything as the investment markets get more difficult. Just a little bit more on that. There's one plan over 8.5%. The bulk of them are still around 7.5%, somewhere in the middle there. We're a little bit more conservative than that now, but keep your eyes open. Probably in September or December of this year, we'll announce the results of that experience study. Okay, now for a little lighter entertainment, we'll talk about the legislature. I think a lot of people have had their eyes on this first set of bills here that would change the retirement age, the minimum retirement age, and the final average earnings from a 3-year calculation to a 5-year calculation. It would only apply to new members only. That bill failed. I don't even think it had a hearing this session. So as of this point, it is dead. We would expect to see it reintroduced in the next legislative session, but that is currently off the radar screen. There's another bill that died in the final days of the session. This would have affected participants in the county jailers classification or protective classification in the WRS. It's another example of some of the cost cutting, I think, that some of our public employers feel they need to do. Many counties have classified their jailers, people who work in the jails that deal with bad people all day and criminals and all that sort of thing. Many have classified them as protective occupation participants, which means they get a lower retirement age, a higher benefit, they're covered by a disability program because they're in dangerous jobs. Of late, counties have started taking them out of that classification because it's too expensive for them to be in. This bill would say that, hey, those jailers are protectives. If they want the added benefit, they have to pay for it themselves. So it's another way to shift the cost to public employees of the benefits that they're earning. That died at the end of the session. We had real concerns about it from a policy standpoint. I know some employers were very concerned about it as well. We'll see if that comes back next session. Some of you who follow our health insurance program may know that the Joint Audit Committee of the legislature directed the Legislative Audit Bureau to conduct an audit of the Group Insurance Board and the State Group Health Insurance Program. This was fallout from the board's decision to pursue self-insurance. So this is kind of the, some would say payback from that decision. Others would say this is just another way to educate the legislators about it. We have tremendous amount of respect for the Legislative Audit Bureau. They do a great job, but they very seldom come up with a finding that says, oh, everything's great. So again, the state group health insurance program we would expect to be on the legislative agenda next session, probably as a result of this audit and recommendations that the Audit Bureau makes. Lastly in this area, Milwaukee County. Some of you have read the news accounts that Milwaukee County is having some issues with their public pension system for county employees. The system is actually fairly well funded. When you look around the country, they're funded about 75, 78%, certainly better than our friends in Illinois. But Milwaukee County has some interesting revenue challenges that they're trying to deal with. Their population in their county retirement plan is heavily weighted to retirees. They have fewer active employees. Continuing to fund and fully fund that program becomes a bigger challenge for them. So they are looking for ways to get some assistance in dealing with the challenge with their pension system. One of the ideas is, oh, we'll let the state take it over. Really appreciate the fact you think we can do a good job with that, but it's really Milwaukee County's issue. So they formed a task force over there. I participate on that task force as a member. The current thinking seems to be that what Milwaukee County would like to do is begin enrolling their new employees that they hire into the WRS. And then they deal with all the costs of their legacy system, all their current retirees and employees and that sort of thing. That doesn't give us as much heartburn. That's them coming in, their employees are earning a new benefit in the WRS, Milwaukee County's paying contributions. That all seems good. So we are there to be helpful to them, to try to help solve or help them solve their issues. It's not done yet. They're going to be meeting for several more months on this topic, but it's something you probably want to keep your eye on, as legislation is probably going to be necessary to pull this off, and you don't know what happens once the legislature starts working on things. You want to keep up on what's going on in the legislature. Tarna Hunter, our legislative director, has a page on our website that you can get the latest information on what's going on in the legislature. She's got memos there that we give to the legislature on policy issues and all that sort of thing. So it's a good resource for people, I think. So real quickly, what's new? People sometimes ask, so what do you do? This is kind of what ETF did last year. Just the sheer amount of information requests. Our call center, many of you have probably called the call center for something. They got 165,000 calls last year that they dealt with. About 28,000 calls just from employers to a separate employer call system we have. 23,000 retirement estimates, 12,000 retirement applications. We're apparently a popular place for people to go to, and we are very happy about that. One of the things we continue to do at ETF is improve our customer service. We have more call center representatives on board these days. We have better access to information. Our communications office is doing a great job improving the information that's available to people online. What else is new? Medicare Advantage. People have been following the Medicare Advantage saga with the Group Insurance Board. The Group Insurance Board decided that it wanted to provide another lower cost Medicare option for our retirees. So they set about soliciting bids for a group Medicare Advantage plan. Simultaneous with that, we decided to survey our retirees about their Medicare option preferences. And lo and behold, 84% of those surveyed would like a Medicare Advantage option if it had a lower premium. Yay! Good news is the Group Insurance Board evaluated a number of proposals, and beginning January 1, 2019, United Healthcare will be providing a much more cost-competitive Medicare Advantage program that has a nationwide network that will be providing uniform benefits. So it's not a scaled-down benefit package, it's the uniform benefits that you enjoyed as an active employee. That contract is still being negotiated with United Healthcare, and the rates are not yet set because the Federal Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services issues those rates later in May. We are going to have a significant communication campaign around this so that you understand your options, and it is an option. None of the other Medicare products are going away. We are adding another Medicare Advantage plan for your choice. And some of you may have heard that Medicare is replacing all of your cards and essentially removing your Social Security number. So you'll be given a new, easy-to-remember 38-digit number or something like that. This is for your own good, I'm told. But getting Social Security numbers out there certainly presents security challenges and privacy concerns. So this is an attempt on the part of Medicare to provide better security for members. That is happening. Medicare is doing that. We are not doing that, but we wanted to offer this as a public service announcement, so if you get a new card, you'll know what's happening. And finally, we moved. March 26th to the 29th, ETF changed locations from our Badger Road facility on the south side of town over to the new Hill Farm State Office building on 4822 Madison Yards Way. Now the good news is that's a new street and it is now available in GPS. 2 weeks ago it wasn't, but it's there now. We have space, it's beautiful space in the new state's office complex there. We are on the top 3 floors of what is known as the North Tower. And our customer service access spot is on the 8th floor. If you need to come see us, you can come up to the 8th floor to do that. It is a secure building, so you'll need to check in at the front desk on the 1st floor and get a visitor's badge and swipe through and you can come visit us. Amenities that we have now, I don't know how many of you came to ETF for your retirement counseling before you retired, but you probably remember meeting in a cube in the middle of a workspace for your retirement counseling. We now have new office space for people to meet securely with our staff to talk about financial and healthcare information. It's a great improvement, both in terms of amenities, comfort for staff. We finally, after about 20 years, have all of our staff in one building so that we can kind of get to know each other again. So it's been very exciting. This is over behind Hilldale Shopping Mall, so there's something to do before or after you come visit us. Another way you can help the Wisconsin economy. And that's where it's located. We have visitor parking available in the parking garage. If you have an appointment to come meet with us, we will validate your parking so that you can park for free, but there is visitor space available. And now I think we're at the point that we're going to take a bit of a break and come back and answer questions.